I've just come straight from London where I've been rehearsing Marriage of Figaro, and my head is full of Mozart. So if I start humming a tune from Act 1, that's why. So here we are to discuss puppets in opera, which I'm really delighted to do because it's something that I have a very personal interest in. And I'm here ahead of a performance in something like 3 or 4 weeks now, here in the Early Music Festival of L'Orfeo, Monteverdi's L'Orfeo, which we're doing with E. Fagiolini, and some puppets, some of which I'm going to introduce you to later. So it's a real pleasure to be here, and thank you very much to the Festival Ideas for having me, and welcome. If I can just start with a little personal introduction to how I became interested in puppets. I've always been interested in sort of how things work, and I think that's why I'm a director now. So I was actually here at the University of York studying for a PhD with Peter Seymour in ornamentation in Schubert Lieder. Feels like a different lifetime. But he introduced me to the ideas of rhetoric, which, of course, in a sense, the ancient Greek art of rhetoric is a study of an analysis of simply what works. If we're talking about communication, what can I do with my voice, with my body, to convince you of whatever it is that I'm saying? And of course, when we're working in theatre, as I'm working in quite a lot, that's really all we're doing. How can we help people communicate with their bodies and their voices? And so that's always fascinated me, and I was a student at the Royal Northern, even another lifetime even further back, at the Royal Northern College of Music, which at that time was very, very strict about things like stagecraft, about what techniques you used to communicate through the body and the voice on stage. And I always used to go on stage and sort of make it up. And when I went to the Royal Northern, I was really pulled up by my socks and showed that wasn't the way to do it at all. There was a discipline to it and a stagecraft. So that fed into this interest that I then grew in puppets. So before we go further into puppets, shall we just define what opera is? It's got I think it's fair to say it's got a slightly interesting reputation at the moment. I confess that I grew up not a fan. I used to play the violin and I used to sing in choirs, and it was all very wobbly and not necessarily in tune. And I didn't really have the imagination, I think, at that time to sort of stomach it. And then I started to be interested in singing, and I used to love the French singer Gérard Souzet and Lieder and French song. Do you know Gérard Souzet? 1950s in particular, yes, marvellous. If you don't know him, look him up, but don't listen to anything after about 1965. But the early 50s, absolutely wonderful, tender singing. So I began to be interested in singing for itself, and started to turn towards operatic singing. And as you'll probably know, I'm sure plenty of you sing, right? Have you had singing lessons in your life? It can be an expensive business. I had a Swedish singing teacher who used to have a picture, and this was a life-changing thing for me, of a baby in an absolute hysterical fit just above the mirror that we had to look at when we were singing. And this baby was shrieking. And her idea was, and I realize it's not a completely original idea in a sense, is that what we're doing when we're singing like an opera singer is, in a sense, imitating or recreating or being like a baby crying. And I suddenly thought, that makes quite a lot of sense. Because babies don't cry all the time. But when they do, it's loud. And they never get tired. You never get a baby going, terribly sorry, a little bit of a cold, not today, I'll do it tomorrow. And they go on for hours if necessary. And why do they cry? Hunger? Illness? Lack of sleep? Being ignored? Attention? Maybe they need their nappy changing. If you took any one of those things to extremes, if you didn't feed a baby long enough, if you didn't clean it very well, if there were sleep problems, if you ignored it long enough, what happens? Baby's going to die. So every single one of us is born with a vocal mechanism that can communicate maybe over a large distance and without stopping until that need is serviced. It's a life and death thing. Which is why opera is always about love and death too, right? So that changed my view of what opera is. It's not about perfection in music. It's about an extreme human activity which is emotional and about need. So suddenly I would go to the opera, and instead of expecting to hear my favorite Puccini melody or my favorite Purcell melody, I was interested then in looking at someone who was in an extreme situation as a person, who then, and if you get a chance, ladies and gentlemen, I do recommend you ask permission first, to pick up a baby when it's crying. If it's not yours, of course, if it's yours, it's fine. And you will see, if you're interested in it at all, that they have perfect vocal technique. All that money we spend on singing lessons, their breathing, their tongue position, their jaw, and they're incredibly active. They use their whole bodies. I'm forever saying to singers, use your whole body, because we tend to sit there like that and try and sing. Whereas if we come at it from what we actually is, this human activity, then the voice works, and you won't get tired. Easier said than done. We're all grown-ups and we have other worries. But it was a fascinating thing for me, and it changed my view of what opera was. And everything I've done since then has been with that in mind. Of course, opera, the word itself comes from the Latin opus. I'm sure you know that. And the plural of opus, which means a work or a created thing, is opera. In other words, it means works or created things. So opera is, in a sense, an umbrella of storytelling, which has singing in it, has music in it, orchestral music in it, maybe has dance, certainly has other elements of theatre. And in that context, puppetry isn't such a weird thing, maybe. So if that's opera, what is puppetry? What are puppets? There are a number of types of puppets. Here's one. Finger puppets. Beautiful Chinese finger puppets. Difficult to find a good picture of finger puppets, but that's one. These are some French glove puppets. Again, difficult to find ones that aren't just children's toys, but rather lovely. Will you be familiar with this sort of puppet? String puppets, what we'd normally call marionettes. This is a current, contemporary puppet company called Handspring. And what they're demonstrating is what's sometimes called bunraku puppets. Bunraku puppetry is a very specific historical Japanese style of puppetry. But what people mean nowadays when they talk about bunraku puppets is they mean you can see the puppeteers. And in bunraku puppetry, traditionally there are 3 puppeteers, one for the head, one for the right arm, and one for the feet. And they put the energy into the puppet and it comes alive. Interestingly, in bunraku puppetry, you have to do the feet for 20 years before you move to the arm. And then you have to do 20 years on the arm until you can move to the head. So the people doing the heads are always quiet, but they know what they're doing. Bunraku puppetry. This is a company called Royal de Luxe. I don't know if you know of Royal de Luxe. Huge, enormous puppets that can be walked around a city. Here's another one. There's a sort of pageantry to them. Very different from a finger puppet, but nonetheless. Shadow puppetry. That's a grim fairy tale. So very, very popular in Europe, particularly in the 18th and 19th centuries. Magical, suggestive, and of course very common in the Far East. Last one here is a tabletop puppet. A bit more about tabletop puppetry in a moment, but it's so, the artistry is so apparent, isn't it? It's so, the artifice is so apparent. That's going to be interesting when we come a little further. When I began working with I Fagiolini, which was some 20 years or so ago, one of the first things I did was a production of The Indian Queen, Purcell's Indian Queen, which I don't know if you're familiar with. It's a semi-opera, and there is a lot of speech in it. And the director's idea was that the singers, of which I was one, would act out with puppets, while the actors, who were the aristocrats of the household, was the idea, and we were the servants, would speak the lines. And we weren't very good at it. And we would always be a bit behind the speech and doing obvious things like, "Hark, Montezuma," except we'd do, "Hark, Montezuma." And I don't know if you're aware of singer Matthew Brooks, a wonderful bass player, sung here a lot in New York, a wonderful man. He played the part of Ismeron, who is a magician. And he comes out of the cave at the summons of Montezuma to give a prophecy. And he sings the aria in the Purcell opera, "Ye twice 100 deities." I don't know if you know, that's a wonderful, wonderful piece. Instead of shuffling about on the floor with these puppets, as the rest of us were doing, he had a tabletop puppet, a little bit like this one. And I was sitting there in the room as it was rehearsed, and suddenly I got it. I got something extraordinary. And there were two key things about that moment. One was that this was a character who was coming out of the back of a dark cave, and a magician surrounded by his shamanistic accoutrements, reluctantly coming. And there was this creature on the table that had none of there was no cave, there wasn't even any light to make it dark, but here was a character that you could completely and utterly invest in. And when Matthew sang through the puppet, the ears were as open as the imagination. And it was an absolutely wonderful thing to see. And ever since then, it's always been crucial to me that the person who is generating the idea, generating the text, generating the song, is the person who is working the head. Because I have seen many times in operas where the singer, who's the paid singer after all, he's not paid to be a puppeteer, stands at the side and sings, while very, very good puppeteers move the puppet. And that simply won't work for me. It has to be this communication through. And suddenly we're getting into this detachment from the artist. Suddenly we get into a very, very interesting idea. And it goes back to what I was saying at the beginning, that this is the kind of thing that has really fascinated me all along. Why does that work? What is it about what's happening there with a singer putting it through another object in front of an audience? What's happening there to make that work? That's what I'm hoping we're going to get on to talk about soon. But before we do that, if I can, I'd just like to give you a little bit of a history of puppets and puppetry. Puppets have been, I'm going to read this bit. Puppets have been an integral part of theatre from the beginning. And like theatre, puppetry appears to have been born in ritual and religious ceremony. In my interest in puppets, I've come across so many interesting writers. One of them is someone called Magnin, and writing in 1852. And he had this idea that they were used in ritual and religious ceremony and shamanistic rites. And that makes some kind of sense to us. Other people have carried on that idea. 20th century researchers, there's a visionary French theatre director called Gaston Batty, early 20th century, and in Germany around the same time, Otto Spiess. It's always impressive when I give you names, isn't it? There have been other views, though, not just that they were born in ritual. Richard Pichel believed that as an art form it originated in India and was disseminated across the world by gypsies. And others, like Reich and Laufer, held that the strong role puppetry has played in the cultures of what we would call the Far East themselves originated in ancient Greece. That's a familiar idea too, isn't it? That ancient Greek theatre with masks and puppets. I'm going to come along a bit to that too. But however specific one becomes in one's search for an origin of puppetry, one is always brought back to this idea that rituals were where they were most found useful. And I think that's an idea that makes instinctively good sense to us. When humans want to communicate stories, as they have always done, they have always used objects, figures, and representations of some kind and manipulated them. Sometimes those figures are drawings on the wall of a cave, and they're not manipulated. But it's very, very small gap from having a picture to creating something, to modeling something, which you can then move. I've got a quote here from a really interesting writer on puppetry called Henryk Jurkowski, quite a recent Polish writer. Researchers have proven that puppets existed in religious rituals, mostly in those of primitive communities. At this stage, they were not called puppets and were obviously not used as entertainment objects or theatrical elements. However, they were crafted to replace either humans or divine beings and were often manipulated. Most researchers agree that the birth of puppet theatre has the same origin as that of live theatre, which is also derived from religious and ritual ceremonies. Still today, puppet theatre in India and Southeast Asia provides several religious functions, and African puppeteers are often part of much larger ritual ceremonies. So this idea that it's going on still now, that the value of it is a kind of essential human value. There's nothing particularly external about puppets to a human way of communicating stories, either religious or in any other way. And that, to me, that makes sense. That animating an image as a representation of a deity or a human was a vital way for primitive communities to share in public storytelling events, as a way of educating, guiding, binding, identifying, and passing on knowledge and culture from one generation to another, as well as, of course, as entertaining. It reminds me of something which which every time I hear John's Gospel read, in the beginning was the Word, en arche en hologos. In the beginning was the Word, and hologos, of course, is a Greek translation already of the Hebrew, but it's a reductive translation in the sense that logos doesn't just mean word, it means the joining of idea to idea, logic. It means the way we think constructively. It means narrative. In the end, it means story, and is often translated as story. And when we think about that, in the beginning was the Word, in the beginning was an idea of narrative, an idea of story. You get some idea of how central, I think, storytelling is for humans. And that's interesting nowadays, as computer games, as film, as everything becomes so visual. We do still in cinemas, but cinema, even that's a detached experience. But to actually get together as people in a space to have a story told to us, that's something we mustn't lose, because if we do, we're losing something very, very basic to who we are, I think, as humans. Just a thought. It makes sense, too, that this ability of puppets to represent, to idealize, in a way, a character, to symbolize a character, as well as inspire the imagination of those who are looking at it, is something that was central to, and in some cases even preceded, the development of any other form of theatre. So to sum up, I suppose, what I'm trying to say is that puppets and theatre are not only born around the same time and from the same impetus, the same starting point, but they are also absolutely trying to do the same thing. And that same thing is an incredibly human thing to do. Well, I'll come to this in a minute, but yes, I'd like to just share with you now a clip. It's a few minutes, just 3 or 4 minutes, and it's a certain type, it explains it, it's a certain type of puppetry, but I'd love to talk to you about that after we've experienced it.
Renowned for its elaborate puppets and complex musical styles, the ancient wayang form of storytelling originated on the Indonesian island of Java. For 10 centuries, wayang flourished at the royal courts of Java and Bali, as well as in rural areas. Today, wayang is practiced not only on Java and Bali, but also on the islands of Lombok, Madura, Sumatra, and Borneo, where various local performance styles and musical accompaniments have developed. Wayang performances are visually striking, owing mainly to the puppets themselves. Although these carefully handcrafted objects vary considerably in size, shape and style, 2 principal types prevail. The 3-dimensional wooden puppet, wayang klitik or golek, and the flat leather shadow puppet, wayang kulit, projected in front of a screen lit from behind. Both types are characterized by stylized costumes and facial features, and articulated body parts. The master puppeteer, or dalang, carefully manipulates the swiveling arms by means of slender sticks attached to the puppets. In the past, puppeteers were regarded as cultivated literary experts who transmitted philosophical, moral and aesthetic values through their art. The words and actions of comic characters representing the common man have provided an acceptable vehicle for criticizing sensitive social and political issues, and it is believed that this special role may have contributed to wayang's survival over the centuries. Wayang stories borrow characters from indigenous myths and ancient Indian epics, while heroes from famous Persian tales feature prominently in the distinctive narrative styles developed in Java and Lombok. Spectators of all ages are passionate about the performance. Samar, one of the most popular figures and the wise counsellor of the king and lords, comes on stage. A choir accompanies the performance with its singing. Samar crosses the stage. Samar is an important figure present in all performances. The music helps to create different atmospheres appropriate for each scene. Thanks to his master's skills, Karang is able to dance to the rhythm of the orchestra, which is conducted by the dalang, using a little bell and a small drum. The Korokora demon and Vishnu come on stage. Ramawiyaya gets ready to shoot the magic arrow. The spectators are enthralled. The Rarono demon is hit by the arrow. Great, I'm just going to leave it there.
couple of things that really I love about it. One is the interesting use of music and singing, and how that seems to go to be so much part of it. The other thing I love is the audience and the mixture of ages and the fact they're all there. Yes, that's actually an example also of where in that culture, puppet theatre preceded normal theatre by far. So Wayang theatre is puppet theatre. That's what it is. They didn't develop humans doing the storytelling as actors for years. This idea of the music and the singing sort of being in the same world as the puppets is something that we're obviously going to explore a little bit as regards opera. But I'm just going to have a little bit of a survey of how music and puppetry have gone together in historical terms. There's an interesting article by Cristina Grazioli, who's a puppet expert, an Italian puppet expert, writing very recently. Music is an essential component of puppet theatre. Indeed, puppet theatre in the first instance depends not so much on the text, obviously, I suppose, as on the active visual element, and makes more structured use of the integration of sound and image than is the case with actors' theatre. And she quotes from a Swiss puppet theatre composer called Hans Jelmoli, 1877 to 1936. And he suggests that music is a means of augmenting the effect of illusion needed by puppet theatre. That's really interesting, I think. The invisible and immaterial nature of sound allows it to melt more easily into the space alongside moving forms. That all sounds very sort of abstract, doesn't it? It goes back to a little bit of my experience when Matthew Brooke was working the puppet in the Purcell, Indian Queen. But as my imagination was stimulated, as the action of making something which is essentially known by everybody to be artificial, the action, the suggestion that is made by the puppeteer to make something actually seem real, that magical moment when the brain opens is also a moment when the ears open. And suddenly there's an awareness in the room. I found that to be the case without fail with the work I've done so far in opera and with puppetry. It's a sense that the audience, if it goes well, are absolutely attentive and aware of what's going on. There's a rather wonderful example of this, which I'm just going to play you. It's a short clip of a film, The Double Life of Veronique. I don't know if you know that, a wonderful film by a Polish director, Krzysztof Kieślowski, in which music is conceived, it says here, and I think it's right, as an accompaniment, not as an accompaniment of the performance, but rather as an intrinsic element of the scene in which movement of the puppet is the essential element. And if you're interested in that idea of this bonding together, then I've got some more things for you which I can share afterwards. Here is a rather beautiful scene with the music. and it goes on. I'm just going to stop it there, partly for time reasons. That character rocking in the background then comes forward and tends to her, and she wakes up having been covered and has butterfly wings. And isn't that wonderful? But it's so interesting to see how the music is such a part of the storytelling, with that very delicate movement and balanced storytelling through movement. It's also a really good example of something which is going to be useful in L'Orfeo and was useful for us when I did Dido and Aeneas recently with a similar approach, that puppets die very well. All you have to do is walk gently away from them, and that's it. There's no heaving of the chest or thinking they've got to get up in a minute and go and have a bow. Yes. I've actually already said this, but this is where I was going to talk about how that magical moment when we believe something to be real also opens the ears. And it brings me on to talking briefly about some more philosophy behind why it works. Are you familiar with the writer Heinrich von Kleist, early 19th century writer who died young? And he wrote an article which is beloved by everyone who's read it that I've come across, called Über das Marionettentheater, on marionette theatre. And it's really not on marionette theatre at all, except as a starting point for larger ideas. But it's so interesting about how it uses puppetry to start a discussion about those ideas. He's in a conversation, Kleist is in a conversation with a dancer who comes every day to watch some puppetry in the street, and we'll come on to that in a minute. I keep saying that, but we will. About how puppetry was very much often a street, especially in the 17th century in Europe, of a street theatre thing. So there's a dancer watching it, and he's finding that the way the puppet can move from a single point of balance enables it to move more beautifully and more truthfully than a human ever can. And by the same token, when the puppet are acting, because they are not self-conscious, of course, they can approach the ideal of a character more than ever human can. That's a very interesting idea, and I really recommend you read that article, Über das Marionettentheater. It's easily available in English online. But it's wonderful the way it starts to introduce this idea of what puppets can mean beyond simply being objects that represent characters. Yes. I don't know it. I can look it up for you. I don't have that answer. No, it's lovely. It's a lovely piece, isn't it? I don't know if it was written especially for it. Yes. So there's this. It brings us on this philosophical way of thinking about them to ideas of how we as audience members receive the idea that the puppet is alive. And that takes us to quite Freudian ideas about projection and transference, and familiar with Winnicott's ideas of transitional objects, how someone can put something into an object in order to move on in their lives and develop. But from the audience point of view especially, one of the reasons the puppets work so well, I think, is that we project onto them. They aren't alive. They aren't real. This beautiful mask, which we'll be using in Orfeo, is a thing, but soon as we make any kind of suggestion that it's alive and real, we make a step, don't we? We project. What we're doing is projecting our own. And when we do that, we're very, very close to what, to me, I think, and to many people, is the essence of theatre. We're about inspiring your imagination, not about telling you what to think. There may have been as many interpretations of what I just did as there are people in the room in terms of what she was thinking. I could ask you, but it would take all night. But what you've done is you've accessed your own understanding of what it is to be a human, what a character could be, your own wealth and bank of experience and knowledge and feelings, and projected on something which you know absolutely is not real. That's the absolute essence of not just puppetry, but theatre. We're about inspiring imagination. And that's the way that works with music is potentially interesting. I'm just going to share with you one or two more thoughts about this philosophical approach to what puppets are and how they work. And just to share that this idea that as I've become interested in puppetry, it was wonderful but not entirely surprising to come across really serious philosophical writing about it. One such pioneer in the field of puppetry was Richard Teschner, a Viennese theatre director writing in the early part of the 20th century, and he emphasized the specific and unique characteristics of puppetry as opposed to this idea of them simply representing a character. The puppet, he said, created a fantasy world which related to the dreams and emotion of the audience. He saw puppets as metaphors. Dreams and illusions are often more powerful, he said, than reality. At about the same time, another writer called Paul Brahn also renewed the puppet theatre with his Münchner Künstler. He thought of puppetry as a Gesamtkunstwerk in which art, music, and movement formed a unique whole. And a Swedish pioneer, Michael Meschke, a German-born Swedish pioneer towards the middle and end of the 20th century, has suggested this lovely phrase: at the point at which actor and puppet both serve as instruments, it becomes less and less relevant to distinguish them. Music and character are born together, and the music is never a mere illustration of the action. That's a very exciting idea, I think, that puppetry can unlock the essence of musical theatre as well as just be a way of experiencing the story. There's something about the experience that I had watching Matthew Brook work that puppet which was essential because it unlocked the character through the music. And that's always fascinated me. I think that's what he's saying there. Time's getting on, ladies and gentlemen, but I realize I haven't really given you any history of the use of puppets in opera. I'm going to do that fairly briefly, and then I'm just going to go on to talk a little bit about Orfeo and then share one little bit of actual puppetry with you with some music. So here we go. The first known encounter between puppets and bel canto, which is the way of describing that very classical way of singing from the early 17th century that reached its height in the 19th century in Puccini and so on, took place in France in 1647. And when you think that the first operas were happening just at the beginning of that century, we're very, very close to the beginning. And that was when a presentation of a miniaturized version of Luigi Rossi's Orfeo by puppets was given, and they were called Petits Fantoches, little phantoms. Later we have a record of Dominique de Normandin, Opéra des Bamboches, dating from 1675, with larger 4-foot puppets. That's pretty big for a puppet, imitating dance, singing, and acting. Another variant on this idea of opera for puppets was presented at the fairs of Saint-Germain and Saint-Laurent in the 1680s in vaudeville comedies, where recitation alternated with sung sections drawing on well-known popular songs. Here too, the theatre of bambocci, which is Italian for dolls, followed hot on the heels of a genre of musical theatre performed by flesh and blood actors. And we're getting quite close to commedia dell'arte here, where masks and puppets and the language, physical language of theatre was mixing very much with puppets and street theatre and street entertainment. Music also playing a large part in that. Famous singers also found their way to the puppet theatre. At the end of the 18th century, Michael Kelly, don't know if you're familiar with him, famous Irish tenor who sang for Mozart and various other people, attended a performance in Padua of Orfeo ed Euridice, in which the castrato Gaetano Guadagni sang. He was an extremely famous castrato singer, and he was singing specifically for a puppet theatre. Since his retirement, he had sung only in the chapel of Sant'Antonio, but relived his former glory in the puppet theatre. Aristocratic palaces in Rome also welcomed doll operas, bambocci operas, La Pastorella, libretto by Pietro Ottoboni, a pastiche of arias by Scarlatti, Bononcini, Cesarini, among others, was performed in 1705. And it seems to be the only work for puppets, apart from one other in 1680, for which the score has been preserved. I haven't come across it. As Roberto Leidl has observed, the art of puppetry, I love this, embodies the two faces of 18th century theatre. I love it because I think it's a very current idea too. The search for realistic imitation of the human, of what it's like to be human. So it's an artificial thing, but how do we represent what's really being human on stage, alongside a taste for the fantastic and exotic? That's a very current idea, especially in opera, where you are never going to see two performances of La Bohème that are the same, because there's a huge pressure to do a new one and to make something completely new, and that results in sometimes ridiculous things that go on in the search for newness. Puppets are interesting there too, because they can be strikingly modern, because we're not used to them, and still just be about the essence of what's going on. So they don't have to be set in Venezuela in a petrol station. I'll just quickly tell you about something you may already know about, which is the Esterházy family, and Haydn, who was, Esterházy was the patron of Haydn, and he lived in the castle, and in that estate was a dedicated puppet theatre. And as you may know, Haydn wrote operas specifically for it. Philemon et Baucis was one of the most famous, and that was the one that Marie-Thérèse, the empress, came to see at the invitation of Esterházy, and she said, this is the best acting on an operatic stage I've ever seen, talking about the puppets, and she asked for the entire puppet theatre and everybody working in it, exactly the same people, to be transported back to Vienna, where they gave another performance. She was absolutely transfixed by these puppets, and actually there's another nice thing. There was a performance given in London of this opera, and a critic from the Gazetteer, Haydn was also at this performance, said, "So well did the motion of the puppets agree with the voice and the tone of the prompters that after the eye had been accustomed to them for a few minutes, it was difficult to remember that they were puppets." Into the 19th and 20th centuries, there was the Salzburg Marionettentheater. There's been a great number, especially in the 20th century, actually, especially in Europe, of specialized operatic puppet theaters. I don't quite have time to go into those things. They're a rather niche thing. They're popular in a way, but they're often nowadays done with recordings of operas and a stylized kind of puppetry, which has historical value because of how far back it goes, but actually is an interesting aspect of puppetry theatre, which I don't like. That's why I'm not going to talk about it. But it's a very valid thing. But I do want to get ahead a little bit to the 20th century now. So there has been a revival of interest in puppetry in theatre. And I've been involved doing it for about 15 years. I directed a Winterreise with puppet, which I sang. I even did it here, yes. And then did some work with Fairy Queen, and recently with Magic Flute and this Dido. And you'll be familiar with Warhorse. That's the handspring company we saw a picture of earlier. When I did the Dido and Aeneas that I just recently did in the Barbican, with some of these same masks, but different puppets, I was sitting next to somebody in the audience, this happens sometimes, and it's rather nice, who didn't know who I was, and quite rightly, and said, he was looking at the program and thinking, puppets. Warhorse, he said, has a lot to answer for. I think he was converted by the end, but by then he knew who I was, so he may have just been polite. But Yes, Warhorse, Madame Butterfly, there's a well-known production, Sam Mendes production at the English National Opera of about 10, 12 years ago, which used a puppet for the child, which was very interesting. The Grinning Man is a musical that's just been in the West End in London, there's puppetry is becoming very much more known and used in theatre, and the man who runs the Handspring Company has described it as theatre's missing limb. And I love that because, again, it's not this idea that it's a newfangled thing. And I hope that's come across tonight, that this is at the heart of what it is to make theatre, whatever you use. Puppetry is not an odd thing. But here we are then on the brink of performing the L'Orfeo here in 2019 with you if you're coming. It'd be delightful to see you there. And I'm just going to introduce you to one of the puppets, and I'm going to talk about why I think it's a good idea to do this particular production. What's interesting about this part of tonight is that I have to justify these sort of things in front of rooms of people quite often because as the way opera works and the way it works with the directors, that we meet the cast on day one of rehearsals and they have no idea what they're going to be involved in. And I've probably been thinking about it for 2 years. So I then have to, in as encouraging a way as possible, suggest to them, in this case, for instance, that they're going to be working puppets, which can be a shock. This is Euridice. And you'll see some more of her later. She sings very beautifully. Thank you. And these are some of the chorus masks you've already seen. So, why do I think doing L'Orfeo with puppets is a good idea? It's absolutely not a given. One shouldn't do puppets with any opera, necessarily, in my book. There are 3 things that I think are important, some of which we've touched on. One is this idea that we want essentially to inspire the audience's imagination in anything we do. So we want to connect the audience to characters in a way that doesn't feel like they're being told. Puppetry absolutely has to engage people, otherwise it doesn't work. And of course, as an audience member, you can absolutely choose not to engage. That's absolutely fine. But it will only work if engagement is built in to what we're doing. As it happens, this Orfeo that we're also doing in London, and we have some outreach work connected to it. I run a charity called Music and Theatre for All, and we are working to try and make opera and musical storytelling accessible in a genuine way. So we're going to schools, we're working with people who have mental difficulties, special needs, and we're trying to, and bringing them in as well, and we're trying to do, from the very way we're telling the story, make it absolutely accessible to everybody, including people who've seen it 17 or 18 times before. It should be a way of telling storytelling which can work. I think puppets can do that fantastically. So the first reason is for the audience, because I think they can be a wonderful way of telling a story. The second reason is the piece itself, because L'Orfeo is, of course, the Greek myth of Orpheus going down to the underworld, which has interesting mental health resonances. Going down to the underworld was, being a Greek myth, everything has a resonance, has an externalization of an internal psychological idea, right? We're familiar with that idea. When Orfeo goes down to the underworld, he's not just going on a trip to somewhere a little bit damp and dark and scary. He's going deep into his own soul, and maybe into depression, and trying to find answers when he doesn't know if he can ever come back from that place. So puppets in that sense can be this idea we've talked about of being representative, of being idealized. And if we have a character that you are projecting onto, that strikes me as being of the right kind of area for when we're trying to tell the story of a myth. because it has to be a story which applies to absolutely everybody in some way, in some unique way. That's the idea, and that's exactly what's happening with a puppet. That you are beginning to make your own connections and to yourself. So the combination of those two ideas plus point 2b, that the idea of Greek chorus being masked, the idea of Greek theatre, Hephaestus making these mythological characters. Hephaestus was on Mount Olympus, was the blacksmith and the inventor, and he would make extraordinary moving things. The idea of puppets is embedded in Greek myth itself, and there are stories, Herodotus, Xenophon, of actual puppet theatre going back to Greece, and I said I'd mention it again, but this idea that some researchers have had that actually that's where it all began, and then spread to India, and then the gypsies took it everywhere. So, hopefully you are my cast today, ladies and gentlemen, are beginning to think this might be worthwhile and might be interesting. And the last thing, which I'm cautious about saying to them, is that they are brilliant teachers. And in that Kleist essay, über das Marionettentheater, that's what the dancer that he's talking to says at the beginning. They are the best teachers. I wish I could get every dance student that I've ever had to come and watch these puppets, the way they move. And I found exactly the same thing with every singer. And for myself personally, they're extraordinarily interesting teaching tools because I think they challenge you to keep a character alive the whole time. They challenge you to keep your mind as a performer on the only thing that matters, not what you are going to have for supper, not with the fact you may have just stubbed your toe, although those things can happen, and you can use all sorts of skills to overcome those problems. But giving up control to a puppet, in other words, serving a character. As a puppeteer, you have to serve the character. You don't think, now we're going to look over there. You don't do anything except believe it's real. I was introducing a show in America, as it happens. I don't wish to name drop, but I was in America, to a group of students. And one of them had a child there. And I was saying, puppetry, one of the things about puppetry is it's a great, great skill. And talk about the 20 years on the feet, 20 years on the arm, 20 years on the head. It's a craft that has a great performance tradition, and we should respect that 100%. Even the way we touch them, the way we look after them, the way we care for them. At the same time, there's something very simple, and we've all held a teddy bear up to a child. And if you hold a teddy bear up to a child and go, hello, how are you? Then the child is likely to be unimpressed. But if you hold a teddy bear up to a child and go, hello, how are you? In other words, if you take the step to believing it's real, then the child in this, with the students, that has a baby of about 1 in the pushchair. And I was just demonstrating that, and I was thinking, I'm going to have to put this to the test. Otherwise, no one's going to really believe me. So I went up to the child and said, do you mind if I mean, the child was quite awake, fortunately, and I did both things. I went, hello. And there's always a risk when you're in my position, when you have to demonstrate things to people, because it can go wrong. You know, you can do, and even tonight, I'm thinking, part of me is thinking, does that look okay? Does that look bad? Because you could all be going, what's this all about? So with the child, I just tried it, and unfortunately the child didn't burst into tears and cry. But I think it's just this juxtaposition between the vast tradition and artistry that puppetry is, and the simplicity of it. The key being, do I believe it's real? And when that happens, sometimes we spend a lot of time just breathing. when I believe that it's real, I do not make decisions, she makes decisions. And that's a great teaching method for any actor or any singer. And one of this same group of students, there was a student who was singing Caronte, Charon, the god who takes people across the river to the underworld. And in our production, the gods don't have puppets, the gods are people. And he wasn't experienced at all. He was absolutely lovely and wonderful young French bass. But he wasn't even very nervous about being on stage. And we found that if he just worked through the puppet, and he repeated it, he was completely freed to do what the breathing, the idea, shows a thought which you then read, which is why isn't so good. And which is why all of us, when we're performing, need the technique of showing what the thought is, that we're struck by something. So for me, ladies and gentlemen, the interesting thing about opera and puppets is not just the history and the tradition and this incredible culture that goes back so far and is finding its way into very modern theatrical practices. It's not just that, but it's the reason why it works that I find fascinating. If it's all right, I'm just going to sing for you one thing, just to end with, because it's where it all began for me, this Winterreiser puppet, which was made for me by the daughter of a designer who's now no longer with us, called Mandarova, her name is. And it's nearly 15 years old, this character. And this, I'm just going to sing for you Der Leiermann, which is the last song of Winterreiser. This character has been exiled from his home because he can't bear to be there anymore because he's lost the love of his life. He's a young man, and he's gone on a journey through the winter countryside and a journey of the soul. And the only time he ever meets anybody is at the very end, and he's a hurdy-gurdy player in the street, and he says, "Can I go with you? Will you play your hurdy-gurdy to my songs?" Drüben hinterm Dorfe steht ein Leiermann. Und mit starren Fingern dreht was kann. Barfuß auf dem Eise wankt hin und her. dreht und seiner Leier dreht ihm nimmer still. Dreht und seiner Leier dreht ihm nimmer still. Keiner mag ihn hören, keiner sieht ihn an. Und die Hunde knurren um den alten Mann. Und er lässt es gehen, alles wie es will. Dreht und seiner Leier steht ihm nimmer still. Dreht und seiner Leier steht ihm nimmer still. Wunderlicher Alter, soll ich mit dir gehen? Willst zu meinen Liedern deiner Leier drehen? Thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you. Thank you.